Welcome. I'm Pastor Russ, and I trust you had a really blessed Christmas. I've been praying for you, church, and now we've got through the Christmas holiday here in 2020. And I want to just say thanks for all your prayers and for your year-end gift. It was a real sweet thing. My wife and I feel really blessed. I want to take us to an event in the Word that took place just after Christmas, and typically we think that this happened at Christmas time, but it didn't. And it's the story of the wise men. We find it in Matthew chapter 2. And it starts out, verse 1, saying, "After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem." So this is after Jesus is born, and it was a little bit of a time period there. It was during the time of King Herod, and this was Herod the Great. He wasn't the greatest king ever, but he was king as a result of Mark Antony. He was designated as king of that area. So he did some good things for the country. He wasn't all bad, but he was pretty much a ruthless, dominating ruler. Well, Magi come, and so who are these guys? Magi were typically astrologers. They studied the stars. They were considered to be wealthy, well-to-do kind of people, scientists. When a king wanted some information, they would often go to a magi of some sort and see if they couldn't help him with that. So they were just known for being smart guys. They came from the east. We don't know how far east, but it's been suggested that they came from perhaps Babylon. Maybe they had heard a little bit something about the king of the Jews being born through Jewish residents in the Babylonian era, just long after Israel returned to the land. There was still a large Jewish population in Babylon. Or they might have been farther east, a land called Parthia. And Parthia, if they were from Parthia, we're talking a couple thousand miles, perhaps. So it was a good distance. The Parthians were feared by the Romans, and they were outside the Roman Empire. And so it was a good little trip if they were indeed Parthians. Well, they came to Jerusalem, and they asked a question that many people ought to ask. Sometimes they don't, but the question was, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews?" Now, Jesus didn't become the King of the Jews. He was born King of the Jews, and there's a difference. He was born a king. They said, "We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." Now, typically, we as Christians expect God to come and find us, right? But these guys, they see a star, there's something that's revealed to them, and they go in search of this king that they believe is somehow divine. He's somehow a great ruler. I mean, even the stars kind of announce his birth. And they go looking for him. So they're obedient to this sign that they get. "We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." Worship is an important thing for us. Sometimes with all the hustle and bustle of Christmas and the holidays, we forget to worship. We take our sights off the King of the Jews, and we wind up putting it on our presents, our relatives, our dinners, and all of the decorations and everything else. But even in this time, the most important time is that we should worship him even now. And worshiping basically is we come before him and we declare how great he is to us, and we recognize his transcendence, his his beauty, his deity. And he's life itself. And we need to recognize that. Well, King Herod heard there was something going on in town. Apparently, this was a fairly good-sized caravan. We think that there was just roughly 3 magi, but the Bible doesn't really tell us. We do know that there was a big enough caravan that when they got to town, everybody was kind of talking about it, and King Herod picked up on it as well. And when he had heard this, he was disturbed, a little bit concerned, like, what's going on here? And all Jerusalem with him. That little phrase there, all Jerusalem with him, we understand that stirred something up. Jerusalem was a pretty good-sized city in this day, and it had been something pretty important to stir up the whole city. When he had called together the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Christ was to be born. So King Herod didn't quite know, so he calls in his wise counselors, and so they tell him. They were chief priests and teachers of the law. Now, the chief priests were probably mostly Sadducees, but the teachers of the law were no doubt Pharisees. They were people who were really concerned about making sure they did everything the law required them to do. So he asked them where the Christ was to be born. And for them, it was an easy answer because they had studied the Old Testament. And they said, well, he's going to be born in Bethlehem in Judea, a little town roughly 5 miles away. It's not far. In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. See, now they're citing the Old Testament when he says, this is what the prophet has written. He's citing the Old Testament, and it happens to come from the book of Micah. And we looked at this a little while back. But Micah writes, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will be the shepherd of my people Israel. So God had revealed to Micah the prophet that his ruler, his great shepherd, was going to be born in this little town of Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem was the town where King David grew up. I think it's fitting that King David, the one he wrote about in the Psalms and the one he prayed to, was going to be born in his little town one day. And he was going to shepherd all of Israel. David was a shepherd himself. He shepherded sheep, and then he later shepherded the nation. And the ultimate shepherd was going to come and shepherd the nation of Israel, and one day he'd be a shepherd to the whole world. Well, when King Herod called the Magi together, he called them secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared, because he wanted to know when all this was going to be taking place and where it was going to be taking place. And so he sends them to Bethlehem and said, go and make a careful search for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him. Now, King Herod says all the right stuff, but we know from later on in the account he didn't mean it. He wanted to find the child and so that he could kill the child. He wasn't happy for a king being born because he himself was king and no one was going to take his place. He didn't like the idea that there was anybody that was going to be a threat to his throne. Well, the Magi probably didn't have any other idea other than King Herod would most certainly want to go and worship the king. I mean, obviously they had traveled hundreds, if not thousands of miles in order to do so. And so they went on their way doing what they could to find the child, and they were going to worship him. They heard what the king said, and they went on their way. And then it says, the star they had seen in the east went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. So this gives us a clue that these magi were perhaps astrologers, because they were looking at the stars, and the stars, they would get feedback, and they could tell the seasons and those kinds of things from the stars. They saw this particular star. Now, just recently, we witnessed the Bethlehem star, which was a conjunction of a couple of planets. Hasn't happened for 800 years, and some would say, well, is that the Bethlehem star? I mean, they named it the Bethlehem star. But it wasn't, because this star didn't move like any of the other stars, because apparently they saw it and then it disappeared for a while. And after they talked to Herod, they're on their way again, and then the star that they had seen, past tense, reappears, and they see it, and it's ahead of them and leads them, and then it stops over the place where the child was. Stars don't do that, okay? I believe this was the Shekinah glory, that God led these magi from the east to come and worship the child in fulfillment of Psalm 72, where David had wrote about his future great-great-great-great-grandson who would one day be worshiped. And they came, according to the scriptures. It's the Shekinah glory that led the children of Israel through the desert. It's the Shekinah glory that filled the temple when Solomon had dedicated. And I believe here it was the Shekinah glory of God that had led these magi. It was the Shekinah glory that lit up the night sky where the shepherds in Luke chapter 2 were living and startled them, and then they went off to worship the child on the night that Jesus was born. This is sometime later. Even the language is a little bit different. It's no longer an infant, but the word that the Greek uses here is a child. He's a young boy. And when they saw the star, how did they react? Well, they were overjoyed. You could imagine a quest like that, traveling hundreds of miles, perhaps 1,000 or more, and coming to the realization that now you're really going to find the one who was born King of the Jews, who you spent months and quite a bit of money trying to find. They're overjoyed. They're tickled. And what do? Well, on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and the first thing they do is they bow down and they worship him. Now, this is the fitting thing to do whenever you come into God's presence. You bow down, you begin to worship. And when they worshiped him, they also opened up their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold and incense and myrrh. Pardon me. They present him with these three different gifts. These were gifts fitting for a king. And they were valuable. And, no doubt, it was a fitting gesture on these magi to give Jesus, well, his family, these gifts. So, I think at this point they were probably going to go back and tell Herod that their quest had been successful. They found the child. That was important. They were so overjoyed that finally the King of the Jews was born. They were there. They worshiped him. They gave him gifts. Everything was super. But just as God had led these men so many miles, now he directs them to do something else. In verse 12 it says, "And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they return to their country by another route. God does that. You know, he can direct his angels. He can direct his Shekinah glory. He can direct wise people, godly men and women, boys and girls, to carry on a message that he wants for others to get. He can do that. He's a God who loves. He's a God who communicates. He's a God who has mercy and shows mercy. And he has these men come and testify that indeed the Son of God has been born. I'd like to go to, I believe it's Psalm 72. And David writes this of Solomon, but I think it's a greater application is with the King of Kings. Endow the king with your justice, O God, the royal son with your righteousness. He will judge your people with righteousness, your afflicted ones with justice. The mountains will bring prosperity to the people, the hills the fruit of righteousness. He will defend the afflicted among the people and save the children of the needy. He will crush the oppressor. He will rule from sea to sea, verse 8, and from the river to the ends of the earth. The desert tribes will bow before him, and his enemies will lick the dust. The kings of Tarshish and of distant shores will bring tribute to him. The kings of Sheba and Seba will present him gifts. All kings will bow down to him, and all nations will serve him. For he will deliver the needy who cry out, the afflicted who have no one to help. He will take pity on the weak and the needy and save the needy from death. He will rescue them from oppression and violence, for precious is their blood in his sight. Long may he live. May gold from Sheba be given him. May people ever pray for him and bless him all day long. Those are a few excerpts from this Psalm 72. And they just talk about a little bit here about how these kings will come and worship the Lord Jesus Christ. These magi are a picture of that. At the birth of Christ, just shortly after the birth of Christ. It's a good thing. And people are still worshiping that king today. And we look forward to his return. One day, every eye will see him. Every knee will bow, and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. And he's going to carry out all of these things that David wrote of him and has been prophesied about him in the scriptures. That is something that we can trust in because the scriptures are true and God always keeps his promises. Now, God may richly bless you, my friends. I hope to see you soon. God bless.